Okay, we are live.
Looks like we're live.
We're here. I am a little too caffeinated, Chris, just so you know. But thank you so much for being here. This is Borican Podcast. This is the first live stream actually that I think I've done in a while as an interview. So thank you. You're the first one.
No, thank you for having me.
And this is obviously like a very important topic, but we'll be diving into a few things during this conversation because I think a lot of the people that have been following me have been people who are very aware of colonialism, very aware. I think at this point, we're very aware of how colonialism is affecting Puerto Rico. But this specific way of how it's affecting and exploiting Puerto Rican students, I think I haven't at least covered it. So I appreciate the work that you're doing. I thank you so much for it because it's super important. And yeah, why don't you introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about your background?
Great. Yeah. So again, super excited to be on the show. Been following your work and thank you for all you're doing for our community. For me, and I was kind of sharing before this, so, my family's from Puerto Rico and, but never was really, plugged in or tapped into the issues that were affecting the island. And it wasn't really until Hurricane Maria when I was working kind of in politics when, we started raising funds, right? And so that kind of like opened my eyes to some of the challenges that were existing over there, and especially when resources weren't getting to communities. But that was about the extent of it. And my background is in education and education policy. So in 2021, when Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona was nominated and confirmed as the Secretary of Education, he asked me to join him in DC, and we had a relationship in Connecticut working together. And so he asked me to come down and he said, look, I know that the Puerto Rico education system is dealing with a lot of challenges. I don't know what the solution is. We're going to figure out a solution or figure out how we can be helpful. But I need you to lead that work. And I wasn't an expert in Puerto Rico education, but based on kind of my state politics experience, he figured that I'd be able to kind of manage the complexities of it. And so I didn't know what I was getting into. I just, kind of knew I knew the general talk about the system is struggling and that students are struggling. And so that was basically my job was for 4 years to figure out how, from a federal standpoint, we could, support the students in Puerto Rico. And obviously that was sensitive because we understand, at least thankfully, our secretary at the time I understood at the time, the complexity of the federal government coming in to help, right? And so we approached that from day one, understanding that complexity and making sure that we were starting with community first. We did a lot of listening for the first year. I won't bore you with the details of the broader work that we did because this is more about the report. But basically, and I'll shut up after this, after those 4 years, I realized that there were so many things in U.S. policy, in education policy, in law that was discriminating against students. And the hypocrisy of it was that Puerto Rico is considered a state under education law since 1965. And so, you start to ask questions about, well, if they're considered a state and they should have the same kind of rights as other states, then why are certain things not kind of aligning? And then as you kind of unpeel that onion and pull back that onion, you realize, oh, well, actually, there's this law that does not apply to Puerto Rico, or there's this challenge or this carve out or whatever it is. And so while on the surface, it looks like, yes, 50 states, DC, Puerto Rico are all states. They all get the same, there's equity there or equality. It's not the case. And so I knew I needed to put this on paper because obviously families, teachers, students in Puerto Rico know what they're living in and the system that they're getting, which is unfortunately inadequate. But there were so many people on the mainland that had no idea, right? Because again, in their head, oh yeah, Puerto Rico's a state, so they should be getting treated as Oregon or Massachusetts. And I was like, no one is talking about this piece. So that's why I know it's super niche and like maybe 2 people read the report, but it was important that that research is out there.
Yeah, no, I don't think 2 people, because I've been sharing it and I'll continue to share it. It's really important to document and to be able to put together all of the data that I have a public health background in epidemiology, so I definitely understand why it's important, and also why it's important to take this data and tell the real story and talk about the humanity behind the stories, right? So I'm gonna give everyone who's watching just a quick summary of the article, just so that they have a little bit of context if they haven't had a chance to read the report. But I just want to say, like, no, it really is super necessary, because there are people in Puerto Rico, like Centro de Periodismo Investigativo, that do have articles constantly talking about the state of not just the education, but the school structure itself, like the physical structure, and how it's affecting students. So Nada, with that, I'm going to read this quick summary. Your article argues that Puerto Rico's educational system operates under layered long-term inequities rooted in U.S. colonial governance and discriminatory federal policies. Although federal law treats Puerto Rico as a state, as you mentioned, under educational statutes, in practice, the island is systematically excluded from the full benefits that states receive, and the resulting disparities have created a deep equity deficit that continues to hinder student outcomes. So that's the summary. I hope people will read it. It's on Centro PR. Actually, let me actually link here, because I have a way to add.
And it's not that long for folks that are looking to read it. It's not 100, 200 pages. It's just a very kind of brief summary of more research that's out there. It's about maybe an 8 to 10 page read. And as you're bringing up, there's a summary here. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad, because I think that I remember when I first saw it, so many things came to mind, specifically, I guess like we can dive into any one of these areas, but I think for me, from a personal perspective, right, as a diaspora Puerto Rican and someone who learned about Puerto Rican history and colonialism a lot later in life, when I was already in my 20s, close to my 30s, and I was in BU, School of Public Health specifically. I'm remembering, 2 professors that talked about these inequities that happen in society. Then Hurricane Maria hits, and Huracán Maria was really like the veil lifting for a lot of diaspora, but it was also a way for us to say, what is going on and how can we get involved? It's weird, because I think about this podcast was a result of that. This podcast is a result of my stepdad passing away 2 months after Maria. Right. And it was that kind of like that pain of coming here, being here on the island for a month, seeing the devastation, feeling helpless, because I didn't have the same skill sets as a lot of other people in fundraising. I'm glad there were people there doing that work. But I felt that with the podcast and talking about this specifically, like how the exploitation really happens, it helps us to get a better picture, because there are a lot of people in the diaspora who, like you said, they're like, we should be treated as a state. Why aren't we being treated as a state? And there's a system designed to keep us in a specific way. So now that I'll let you talk about that.
I think to your last point, about, quote unquote, the system, I'll never forget one of my colleagues when I first started working down in Puerto Rico. He said, Chris, there are a lot of people that want the status quo to remain. And whether that's in education or whether that's, more broadly about Puerto Rico's status, right? But let's, talk about education specifically. And that like blew my mind, because I'll be honest, like I've, traveled around the country. I visited a lot of school districts, and, every school district, and typically I'm working in urban school districts or rural school districts. And while every district has challenges, some a lot more than others, resource challenges, I never left a district saying like, wow, like I always left the district thinking that students were still put first, regardless of the challenges, right? And I can't say the same in Puerto Rico. And so when my friend told me that about the status quo, like that's when I realized like there is more to this story that needs to get out, and we need to keep shining a light on it, because as I feel like as we talk about status as well, like there's the moral argument that's always going to be there, but we really need to start pinpointing the policy arguments on why Puerto Ricanos are struggling under kind of this colonial, like, status essentially.
No, 100%. I think coming here to the island and living here and understanding from people who've like born and raised here who say the same thing, we look at it across the board in different, aspects of not just education, but healthcare here,
Right.
everything. It just
Right.
remains the same. Where, when it comes to your article, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about like, where would you like to start? The historical context on like how there were two different educational, was it structures, two educational statutes?
Yep.
Like, why did that happen? I find it so curious that while Puerto Rico is considered, the territory and it's separate but equal, this whole conversation, what made it be included as a state and they're under the education side?
So I'll answer that part first, and then maybe we'll go back to kind of to the historical piece.
Yeah.
It was 1965. My only guess at the time is that it was just convenient because at that time, Puerto Rico's public school enrollment was more than double what it is today, right?
Wow.
And that was more than at least 10 states. So I think it made a lot of sense to include Puerto Rico in that, because the other territories, they educate far less students in terms of size, right? And their public school. So, because if you were to try to make the argument, well, then why aren't the territories also included as states, right, for the purposes of education law? But my guess, and this is only my guess, is that it has to just do with size and the massive scale of what the system was at the time. I mean, it's still, it's the 7th largest public school district in the country and still educates more public school students than other states. But so just imagine at that time in 1965. So I think that's probably why they were included. And then as we think about the historical stuff, right? So like, I touch just a little bit on it just so people have like a primer, but, for years, the U.S. government, tried to force English on, students in Puerto Rico. There was the Americanization campaign. Now, I do want to highlight the positive side, which is talked about in the report, which is that literacy rates went up, right, during that period. So, that definitely was a good thing. But, there were just a lot of efforts to assimilate students. And again, this goes back to ease, because you have a country, a nation that has a public school system. It has unique nuances. You have rural students, you have urban students, you have, coastal students, but it's like fitting a square peg into a round hole. And that's, now to go to kind of the two examples that we talked about in the report, 40,000 students in Puerto Rico live in what's considered a rural area, and they don't get to benefit from the millions of dollars that come from rural school communities. Now, that's not necessarily something in law that discriminates, but what it is a function of is history, right? So if we know that Puerto Rico has a unitary school system, and we can talk about what that means, then there's nothing that Congress can't do to say, you know what, even though you're a unitary system, we want your students to get this rural funding, right? And so those are some of the things where, again, like I like to say that there's nothing that's limiting Congress except for their creativity, because Congress can do whatever they want, right? Like the U.S. Virgin Islands gets SNAP, Puerto Rico doesn't, right? Like, so, there's all these contradictions in U.S. policy about like what it does for its territories, or what it more appropriately, what it doesn't do for its territories. So the rural schools piece is one. And then the other one deals with Medicaid. And while this is not education specific, basically states can get reimbursed for their for services when they support students with disabilities. And unfortunately, while Puerto Rico technically can, it doesn't, because they don't get the same Medicaid treatment as other states. And this is a long fight, as you know, like between SNAP and NAP. So is the Puerto Rico Health Department gonna decide to take money away from the already fragile health system that it has to serve students with disabilities? Like, that's an unfair decision that the system has to make because Congress chooses to discriminate, right? Like, and so unfortunately, those are two examples. There's another example that I didn't get to in the research because it was incomplete at the time. But like, you have escuelas vocacionales in Puerto Rico, and those are technical schools that, as we know them in the States, that get money through the Perkins Act for supporting students' college and career connectedness. And unfortunately, there is a different formula for Puerto Rico, which I think my research is going to play out, that they actually get less through that formula.
So you have a second article coming out soon? You're working on it?
We'll see.
So.
Yeah, we'll see. I was waiting to see what the response would be from this, like to see, but looks like it may be, I think it's probably a worthy place to go.
No, it is. And I think even if, I would say with things like this, it takes time for people to start like processing and digesting this and also disseminating it. So I hope this is not the only podcast you're on where you talk about this, because I do, like you said, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see and understand, just based on like the points that you made so well, that this is discriminatory and that it hurts Puerto Rican students. So if, let's say in a best case scenario, right? Like, a lot of people wonder about, policy. How are these like policy reports going to help? I know, because I have a public health background, but if you could describe to people a little bit about like what you hope that if this is taken seriously and people actually read it and people actually agree that there's something that needs to be done, what could happen if this is taken more seriously?
Yeah, so I think there's two things here. I think that until Puerto Rico's status is resolved, whether that happens in 2 years or 20 years or 200 years, hopefully not that long. But until then, there needs to be true equity for students, right? And that's not just federal, right? That is also the government of Puerto Rico. Like, something that we talked about in the report is how the government of Puerto Rico funds its education system far less than other states, right? And so, independent of those federal funds, the Puerto Rico government should be doing more for its students, point blank, period. So on the federal side, again, until the status is resolved, Congress should address these inequities. Like, there's no reason why they shouldn't, right? If we believe in kind of like the ideals of our country and all that stuff. Then secondly, that's the policy side of it. Now we get to the political side of the house. And, I think hopefully people realize that the current territorial status is untenable, right? And it's, the report is an attempt to support that argument. The report is not political, right? But you can make different political arguments from the report. The statehood folks will take the report and say, look, because we don't get the funding, this is why we need to be a state and have representation in Congress. I have a section in the report that talks about that, because I didn't want to be disingenuous about that, right? And there's an example of how congressional representation, lack of it, is hurting students, right? So in the absence of that representation, there needs to be equity, right? That's the policy piece. But now let's start talking about the political arguments. And so number one, for me, it's like how the territorial status is untenable and they're getting this disparate treatment. And so we need to now use policy to make the political arguments. So let's put to bed the fact that we want to save the territorial status, right? Let's do that. And then from there, let's start making the argument about, well, so then what makes the most sense, right? And personally, like I believe in a free Puerto Rico. And part of what the report says is Puerto Rico should break from the U.S. education paradigm, right? Now, some people will say, well, if we break from it, then we're going to lose those federal funds. And, again, like those are all other conversations that we can have. But why can't Puerto Rico build the school system that it wants versus putting a square peg into a round hole of a U.S. system? And even if we are not in a place where we're sovereign and we're able to do that on our own because we have the right to do it, but there's nothing that, again, stops the creativity of Congress to allow Puerto Rico to do that and give them the funds, regardless of whether or not they're under the federal education law. Congress can still do that, right? And so we have to start moving now from the policy, right? And we have the foundation. The policy gives us the foundation to do the advocacy and political work that's needed.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better myself. That's amazing. Thank you so much. No, I agree. As you were describing this, and I was thinking to myself, there are so many people that really do believe that with statehood, this could. But I do want to say I agree with you. Like Puerto Rico needs its freedom, and regardless of when it gets it, there are things that can be done in the meantime.
Correct.
You mentioned in this report, 80% of the students qualify for free reduced lunch, highest in the country. There's environments that have leaked ceilings, outdated or absent textbooks, teachers purchasing out of pocket, which is also true in some vulnerable communities in the U.S. as well. But there's, like you said, student outcomes consistently lowest in the nation. And all of these points making the argument that, like, regardless of federal funding, there is a discrimination that is happening here on the island that is not only putting these students in these vulnerable state, but also displacing a lot of them, like myself. My parents were born and raised here. They left, and they left because they couldn't find jobs here. So what happened? I grew up and I was raised over there under, free lunch program because my parents both were, working class people. And so it's interesting because I often think about what would have happened if I had been born and raised over here. My mom is from Tua Baja, so that was likely where we were going to end up. And when you see the schools, when you see the state of the schools, the need for renovations, the fact that the government here in Puerto Rico has money for the renovations and doesn't, move to actually do it, there's a lot. So, I don't know if you want to comment on.
Yeah. So I want to touch on a couple of things. There was a lot of great stuff in there to kind of react to, but the first one that you said at the end was about kind of the renovations of schools. So I personally have a lot of criticism of the local government, the local school department. And, there's a time for that. And I've done that in the past, even when I was in the administration and when I came out. But I wanted this report to stand on its research, right, and not get into kind of the local criticism, right? I wanted to focus on the federal policy. But when we look at, now shifting to that local criticism, I would say one of the most egregious things that I've seen so far is the infrastructure, the lack of infrastructure that's happening, the rebuilding of schools. I mean, Puerto Rico, and I said this in the report, had about $2.3 billion to repair schools as a result of Hurricane Maria and the earthquakes in 2020. Now, that money is not enough, right? I also compared in the report that Hurricane Katrina, after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, they got about the same amount of money for an eighth of the schools, right? Puerto Rico has 850 public schools. New Orleans at the time had about 110, and they got the same amount of money. And there's, we could talk about the reasons for that. But even with the $2.3 billion that you have, we are in November 2025, about to go to 2026. Not one school has been built since then. There are some bureaucratic obstacles that have happened, but it's unconscionable and it's inexcusable that not one school has been built. They put some portable schools up in Guanica after that school collapsed after the earthquakes. But that's like, you buy that off the shelf, right? And so that is one of the main criticisms. And I think people in Puerto Rico should be outraged that nothing has been done. Now the department will talk about, we're fixing the roofs, we're painting this, we're doing that. But like, you know, it's indefensible, right? It's indefensible.
Yeah.
Yes, those repairs needed to happen, and schools needed to be built.
Yeah. And speaking of that, right? The reason that they continue to hold off and it's causing this displacement, right? I was curious. I remember at a certain point they mentioned that there's half as many students now enrollment. So talking about enrollment as well, because I think that, you know, it scared me. I went to Rio Grande, and a friend of mine who lives out there, who is also returning back. She was born and raised here, returned. She said that she was also hearing, you know, anecdotally, we're hearing that these schools are getting less and less enrollment every year. So
Yeah, no, the displacement is real. So there was kind of the first wave of school closures in Puerto Rico around 2020. I want to say under, you know, Julia Kelleher, and there was obviously that was super politically charged, and the community, you know, fought back against that. But there's so many impacts and implications from the displacement. Both mainland, you know, in the diaspora and in communities across the US and in Puerto Rico. So, you know, let's start with Puerto Rico. So number one, for every student that leaves, that is money lost, federal funds, money lost, right? And so then what happens? It's a cascading effect where, so now that allows the Secretary of Education in Puerto Rico to say, well, these schools are under enrolled, so we're going to have to close this school, right? And it's not recognizing that the conditions of the school system are forcing these families to get displaced, right? There's other reasons too, but forcing. When you don't pay teachers enough, right? Then teachers have to decide, well, you know what? I'm getting recruited by Hartford Public Schools, or I'm getting recruited in El Paso, Texas, because there's a shortage of bilingual teachers. So we're going to poach those families. And, you know, like, you have to do what's good for your family. And so I don't blame those teachers who leave, right? But that's also a result of the displacement, right? And I used to be part of that problem. Like, it's funny because when I was working in Connecticut, we obviously, like most states, have a teacher shortage for bilingual teachers. So we're like, naturally, let's, you know, go to Puerto Rico and get these students. And also because we have large populations of students in our communities that are Boricuas. So like there's that cultural affinity. And so, but that was us being part of the problem, right? Instead of, you know, by poaching these teachers, because obviously if they can make double, they're going to do it.
absolutely. Yeah.
So
No, and I don't blame them, because if you
Right.
live here in Puerto Rico, even for just like, even for a month, you're just like, why are all these things backwards? Like, ¿por qué esto está pasando? Why is this happening? And I remember, you know, not to interrupt you, I apologize, but I agree. There's a lot of teachers that have to make that difficult choice between, like, am I gonna get paid enough to like live, or am I going to struggle very hard? And you know, there's always the argument, I think, in diaspora argument, of just like, if you leave, that means you don't care about the island. If you leave, you don't. And it's way more complicated than that. And I think it's really unfair. It's a divisive, you know, conversation. It doesn't help us. We need to create more solidarity. So towards that end, you know, talking about initiatives or things that you've heard maybe anecdotally about like how to solve it, right? If the policy level, you know, if this article does get, like you said, drowned in other things and people don't pay attention, are there community-led initiatives or things that you've heard of? Because you mentioned that one of the things you did was listen to the community.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm guessing that people are already trying to do certain things to try to address some of these things that just it's not enough, right? Because sometimes you think about like the resources that are here, it's never enough. But what are some things that people might be doing that are helping?
Yeah, well, you know, look, let me first say that to this point, like the schools that I visited, I mean, I visited dozen schools in Puerto Rico, you know, hundreds and students, teachers, like the job that the job that teachers are doing in Puerto Rico is like heroic. And what students are doing, like, to get ahead, and like they have every aspiration that every other student wants, right? And so we did see a lot of great community work. One of the first things that we knew to kind of to this point was like, we need to pay teachers more. And so that was one of the things that I was proud of that we did. Like we helped teachers get their first pay raise in 12 years. It's not enough.
In 12 years?
Yeah. So in 2023, I believe it was,
Oh my
So
goodness.
teachers got $1,000 a month pay raise. And I mean, the system was bleeding teachers like at a crazy rate. They, a base teacher in Puerto Rico makes $1,800 a month. It might have gone up a little bit, but the base at that time was $1,800 a month. The base. I mean, PhD, folks making, maybe $2,500 a month. And so they had 2 jobs, maybe 3 jobs. One time when I was in Puerto Rico, there was a teacher who, was working 3 jobs. And so on his way to his 3rd job, he fell asleep at the wheel and died, right? Like these are the things, right? So, but to get to the positive piece, like communities were taking back their schools, right? Like, I mean, we've seen that across the island where schools are being repurposed as community centers and spaces to support not just education, but things beyond that, right? And, obviously we worked with organizations that were really putting students and parents first. And one of those was the Montessori schools in Puerto Rico. So there's public and private Montessori. And Puerto Rico is actually kind of known for its public Montessori schools that it has. There's over 60 of them around the island. They really put students and families first. And so when we were embarking on our policy work, we started, we worked with them. We worked with, folks like Eduardo Lugo and other, folks who are doing great community work with K-12 students to make sure that their voices were basically impacting the policies that we want to change. And at the end of the day, like it was very simple things, right? Like more community voice, like school-based budgeting. Like these are simple things, but obviously, the way that politics is intertwined with education in Puerto Rico is just different than anywhere else. The Puerto Rico Department of Education is the largest agency in Puerto Rico. So when you think about that as an agency and the jobs that you can give and the leverage that you can get, it's unfortunate. And that's why I said, like, I saw how I felt that students weren't being put first. But, on the positive side, like you said, like seeing communities repurpose those schools, seeing, the Montessori system really, put students and families first and making sure that their decisions actually have a voice. So there's definitely a lot of good stuff, but it's tough when you're against the challenges that currently exist in that system.
Yeah, no, thank you for sort of diving into that piece, because it also, as you said, there's only so much a community-led initiative can do. It really needs to happen at the Department, of Education here, and that also brings me, I guess, to the thought that even if like maybe in Washington nothing changes, do you feel like the awareness of what's going on, because people, like you said, people are aware of the problem, but maybe the added pressure of more people calling it out, the added pressure of seeing a policy paper that really breaks it down could have an impact long term. Because again, going back to Huracán Maria, there was a domino effect from that. There was a domino effect in terms of diaspora involvement, not saying diaspora saving Puerto Rico, but just the fact that people wanted to be engaged and figure out ways to amplify and help. So is there a chance, do you think, that that's another avenue to help?
I do. I mean, during these years, like I would see reports or data about public education in the country, and always missing was Puerto Rico, even though it's a state, right? And so I do think that the awareness there's no silver bullet, right? So it's reports like this or op-eds or other things, podcasts, like it's all like part of the larger story that's gonna just move people to say we've had enough. Like we've literally had enough. And obviously I was sad when I had to resign my position, obviously because of the election. But I do think that people are starting to realize that they and the future generations of Puerto Rico students deserve better. Whether it's special education, like one of the things that we saw was that students in Puerto Rico, I mean, Puerto Rico in general has the largest percentage of students that are kind of classified as students with disabilities or learning with disabilities. I mean, 3 times more than national average. And that's not because there's something in the water, right? But that's because if you are not getting the services, the regular services that you need, a lot of families think, well, if I say that my kid has an IEP, he or she is going to get more tutoring, right? And so, and I think that awareness is happening more and more, where people are just like, you know what, like, this is not enough. And it may happen from the other side, right? Like, there's obviously a financial incentive for the Department of Education in Puerto Rico to say, we can't afford to have 35% of students with disabilities. And so we need to give better services in the classroom, right? Like, it's pretty simple. And so maybe there's a kind of a reverse kind of movement for the department to do right by students, because the financial incentive, like, the parents are figuring out how to game the system.
I love the way you said that, because I would have given a much spicier take on that. Pero me encanta. Gracias por decir todo esto. I really hope that people are listening. I really hope people do end up listening to not just this podcast, but others that hopefully you'll be on. Anyone who's watching, please invite Chris to other podcasts to talk about this. Just because, this is, people have had enough. It is super frustrating to see families struggle. I can't imagine having a child in the education system here. I don't have kids yet, but if I did, just would want to do more. I'm sure there are a lot of parents who are involved in this fight as well, who are trying to advocate for especially kids with disabilities. What was I going to say? I did have as you were talking, I was also, digesting in terms of, like, when we think about students, are there any stories, of any students? You mentioned the teacher who sadly died because he had 3 jobs, because that's the only way he could sustain himself. Are there any, like, maybe not so sad, but uplifting stories of students there that you remember?
Yeah, I mean, there was, I remember going to the Boys and Girls Club. I think it was in Bayamón, and just seeing, like, how students at the Boys and Girls Club who are in the public school system. So, I think one of the good things that was happening was, like, the community supports that exist, whether they're from other nonprofit organizations. They know they either need to, if they can't get into the schools, they need to be, like, basically right in the neighborhood, right? And so you have this really great wraparound approach, where organizations like the Boys and Girls Club and other ones that are out there are, like, literally in the caserío, right? Like, and they're there to make sure that once that student steps out of the school, they step into that Boys and Girls Club, and they're doing the local tutoring. And, like, these students are taking charge, right? Like, they're basically they're leading both in the Boys and Girls Club and back in their schools. And so for me, it was, like, really refreshing. There's another great organization called Colaborativo who works at Eloisa, and they had noticed that there weren't students in the community that were going on to post-secondary education, not just college, but it could be a certificate program or whatever it was. And so they focused on the 2 high schools in Loíza to make sure that they were seeing that they could go beyond high school, right? If that's what they wanted to do. And it wasn't, and the beautiful thing about the work that Colaborativo was doing was that it wasn't about the students not wanting to go to college, right? Or if those students went to college, it wasn't about them not finishing because they didn't see it as useful. It was because the transportation system was terrible, right? It was because now they were 18, they finished high school, and maybe they could provide more for the household at that time, right? And so, so for me, like, Boys and Girls Club, Colaborativo, and there's a lot of other great organizations. Obviously, we talked about the Montessori schools. I mean, we also made it a point to go to Vieques and Culebra and see the schools out there, because they are too often forgotten when in this discourse. And so seeing the community that exists in Culebra, I remember the senior, unfortunately, I don't remember her name, but if I remember the stats correctly, like, let's say 25 to 30 students enter into, like, a kindergarten class. And from those students, like, maybe 6 or 7 will graduate high school, right? And it's just because, I mean, we need another podcast to kind of just talk about the issues that are impacting Vieques and Culebra.
We will. We'll do that next.
but but it was just, but communities stood up. They saw, like, no one's coming to save us, right? And so we need to save ourselves. And so the work that communities in Culebra are doing to wrap their arms around the only high school the only school I believe that exists in Culebra, is just phenomenal.
No, it's interesting because I didn't know that fact about Culebra and Vieques, and I would love to do a specific one on them. Maybe bring on someone from there that you might know.
Dulce.
And we can
Shout out to Dulce, who's doing. She's a retired, special education teacher who,
Ay, sí,
she's
vamos
great.
a hablar con ella. Yeah, we'll bring her on then. We'll do this maybe next week. Maybe we'll coordinate with her. Pero me encantaría because I just there are so many stories. I didn't even know that. And I think when I think about those students that are excelling or that, I think about, just reflecting on my own journey of like, I had to do 3 times, 4 times, 5 times as hard to excel or to be considered, and to assimilate in order to be, a lot of people are like, wow, your English is so great. Well, why do you think that is?
No, you're the anomaly, right? You're
exactly. Sí, no, yo estoy como que, you're just like colonialism thoughts. Pero nada, I just want to say thank you. We could go on for another 40 minutes, but I'll keep it here. Is there anything else I missed that you want to talk about or that you want to mention?
The only thing, and you brought this up about the 80% of students on free or reduced lunch in Puerto Rico, and that's higher than any jurisdiction in the country. And it speaks to the fact that we have to address poverty if we're going to improve student outcomes. And so I think there are some people who recognize that, and there are communities that do it better than others. But I think it just speaks to the fact that we need those community organizations, and we need the government of Puerto Rico to recognize that, a student is not going to learn if they're hungry, right? If they don't have breakfast, or if there's issues happening, if they don't have a social worker in school, and all these issues that students living under poverty have to deal with. And the last thing I'll say is, like, everyone should be, even if if you live on the mainland, wherever you live, you should be furious about these challenges that Puerto Rico students have to live through, and they're excelling, right? We have some of the best engineers that are coming, out of Puerto Rico. We have, there's so much talent, right? And we demonstrate that day in, day out in every field. But what's happening in Puerto Rico would not be tolerated in any other state by policymakers, like in their own states, but yet we tolerate it for Puerto Rico students. And that in and of itself is a level of discrimination. So I hope people, while we're going to talk about the positive, we're going to uplift the positives, but we should also be furious about what they have to deal with in order to excel.
Absolutely. It's unacceptable. And I was outraged just reading it for like 5 seconds. I hope more and more people read it and get behind this. So thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you, Debbie.
And thank you everybody who watched the live stream. This is awesome.
Yes,
this is great. I was seeing people commenting and things, but we'll do another one. I do want to talk about Vieques. There's a lot there that still needs discussion. So thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you. All right. Take care.